Right, in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the rise of Napoleon and the end of the French Revolution. Underneath them, the rise of a French empire. We're going to be looking at Napoleon's domestic policies, his international policies, and then the downfall of Napoleon. Your book is going to give you a lot of the details about Napoleon's rise to power. So I just want to focus on and highlight a couple of quick key events before we get into key aspects of his rule. So first off, to begin with his rise to power, it's important to note that he was a very successful general in the French Revolution. He had fought in places like Austria and Italy and Egypt and worked his way up through the French army. He had some losses, but he also had some victories as well. In 1796, he was able to defeat the Austrians in Italy. Although he lost in Egypt in 1798, he was still a popular figure. But it was very important to remember that he was a supporter of the revolution. In fact, what had happened is that the Directory, if you recall from last time and from your textbook, which is what the five-person council that took over after the period of terror under Robespierre, Napoleon had actually supported the Directory for a time, but ultimately in fact, he had actually fought against a crowd of people who had tried to overthrow it at one point. Ultimately, though, the irony of his support for the Directory is that he ends up fighting against it. So November 9th, 1799, he leads an upper middle class coup against it, and his new plan is to replace not only the Directory, but the entire French system with a new political process and new political offices. And this is the concept that is known as the Constitution of the Year 8. That's 1799. Remember that they're dating it back from the beginning of the French Revolution. And what had happened is that a lot of people had sort of lost faith in the Directory, and Napoleon was able to seize on that. And when he takes over, he ultimately is able to give himself absolute power. Now, he sort of hid this in this concept of the consulship, so that there are three co-consuls, and this is a Roman term. That is a term from the Roman Republic, actually, and it was implied that this was a division of powers, right? That there are three co-consuls. But it's very important to remember that Napoleon himself ends up becoming the first consul. So yes, there are these other two, but really Napoleon is the most important one. And this is important considering the process that has happened in the French Revolution, where you've gone from a king to an assembly to the Committee for Public Safety, which was still relatively large, to the Directory of 5 people, then to the 3 consuls, and now to a first consul. So essentially, by the time you get to Napoleon, French politics have gone full circle. They've gone from having a king and one person in charge to a widespread democracy and participation to back to having one individual in charge who's very authoritarian. In fact, what had happened is that in 1802 there was a plebiscite, a popular vote, which granted Napoleon the position of consul for life. So he never had to campaign and run again, at least according to this plebiscite. But what's interesting, though, is that there was an apparent assassination attempt on him in 1804, 2 years later, and it gave him sort of reasons to end the republic that had existed prior to this and just simply declare himself emperor. It's important to note, and that occurs in 1804, but it's important to note that 1799, with the new constitution, is officially the end of the French Revolution. And then between 1799 and 1804 is the period that we refer to as the consulate, so these period of consuls, and that is then followed by the empire. So in 1804, Napoleon becomes emperor, simply declares himself emperor. He makes his descendants successors through inheritance. Ultimately, he actually invited the Pope to witness his coronation, and this very famous painting here from Jacques-Louis David from 1805 to 1807 is called The Coronation of Emperor Napoleon I. And if you look very carefully in this image here, not only do you see lots and lots of people who have shown up to see the coronation of Napoleon, but Napoleon is actually the individual who is standing at the top of the steps. The Pope, if you look very carefully, is actually seated in white behind him, not standing, even though the Pope is seated upon what essentially is a papal throne. And Napoleon here is apparently presenting the crown as well. That is his wife kneeling before him. But the importance of this image here is that although the Pope, although Napoleon invited the Pope to come to the coronation and essentially sanctify it, he did not let the Pope place the crown upon his head. Napoleon did it himself. And this was really a sign to show that he was very much in charge. And the Pope was actually ultimately subservient to him. But the coronation of Napoleon here, it does give you a sense of just how grand it is, and it's something that even Louis XIV, that absolutist monarch, would have not only been proud of, but probably jealous of, because of all of the ostentatious display. So this period with Napoleon in charge, the first period known as the Consulate, and then later under his rule as an emperor, it's important to note in terms of his domestic policies just how strict his rule was. So the Consulate itself runs from 1799 to 1804. And then, of course, he becomes emperor in 1804. Both periods are marked by an authoritarianism. That is, the state is very authoritarian, very much in charge. Napoleon continued many policies of the terror. He had his own personally selected prefects in various departments. He limited political participation and expression, some of the things that went against the Declaration of the Rights of Man. He allowed voting in plebiscites only. He employed a secret police. He used spies and informants to make sure that everyone was believing, acting, and participating in the French state exactly the way that he wanted to. Dissenters were dealt with very, very harshly, either through imprisonment or sometimes even with death. He also, in 1801, established what is known as a concordat, an agreement with the Pope in Rome. Napoleon understood the value of religion as a tool for him for social control, and he wanted to harness this power and use it for the state. So he did restore the Catholic Church to its official position in France, but he also placed it under a lot of restrictions, many of which had existed under the French Revolution. The priests and members of the church who were French still had to swear oaths of loyalty. They were still paid salaries by the government. He actually gave Protestants and Jews limited rights, and of course, was not very pleasing to the church at the time. But because of this prominent position that Napoleon gave to the church, the Pope was happy and gave the regime his blessing. And a lot of people, as you remember from the discussion of the resistance to the very secular policies of the French Terror, a lot of the people appreciated this return to religion. But in fact, a lot of people also knew that Napoleon was just simply doing it for himself. Now, once he becomes emperor in 1804, we see an even further establishment of what is known as the Napoleonic Code. This is a conservative approach that's meant to safeguard things like property and the social order. He very much returns to a prior version of French politics and governance. It's very, very conservative. He did confirm the abolition of privileges by birth. He did confirm the end of feudalism and serfdom, and that no offices could be sold, that they had to be based on merit. But he also de-emphasized the revolution's focus on things like equality, because he favored those who supported him. He did reinstitute titles of nobility. He forbade workers' organizations. He strengthened patriarchy by giving men the ultimate power over their children and wives. And this wasn't just in France, but in any of the countries that Napoleon came to control, as you will see when we move on to the next map in a moment. One of the most important aspects of Napoleon's rule during this period, the Napoleonic Code, is the Imperial Catechism that you read. Now, the Imperial Catechism was a document that is modeled on a Catholic catechism, and the idea is that this is both a religious and a political document at the same time. So because this document is a merging of both political and religious beliefs, what it does is it goes through and does a simple catechism approach, which is question and answer. And so usually this is done in terms of religious belief and ideology, but in this case it combines them. So for example, one of the first questions says, what are the duties of Christians towards those who govern them? And in particular, what are our duties towards Napoleon I? Well, it has its own answer in there, and it says Christians owe to those who govern them, and we in particular owe to Napoleon, it says, our love, respect, obedience, fidelity, military services, taxes, all of which are done for the preservation and defense of the empire and his throne. We also owe him prayers for his safety. So this idea that it is not simply a duty of a citizen, but it is a Christian duty to support Napoleon. The second question is, why are we subject to all of these duties? And it's very clear in this document. It says, because God, who has created empires, distributes them according to his will, and therefore he put Napoleon in charge. And it's very blunt, this document. It says, to honor and serve our emperor is therefore to honor and serve God himself. And then it goes on to give an example of Jesus rendering authority to Caesar. And then at the very end of this document, you get a question that says, what do we do about those people who are not as patriotic as they should be? And the answer is, according to the Apostle Paul, the document says, they are resisting the order established by God himself and render themselves worthy of eternal damnation. This is very important because in the first part it says the sort of Christian duties of citizens to follow Napoleon, and in this part here it follows that up by saying if you do not follow Napoleon, if you are not a good citizen and a loyal citizen and a supporter of his, that you can be damned to hell. And that's very important for understanding exactly how Napoleon is able to effectively merge church and state. Napoleon was also very much involved in the development of arts and sciences. He was very much a patron of the arts and the sciences. He had intellectuals as advisors. There were also a lot of very important scientific discoveries during his time, including the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, a stone in Egypt that had two forms. It had a form of hieroglyphics on it and two forms of Greek. Prior to this discovery, nobody had been able to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs for, in this case, about 1,800 years. Nobody knew what they meant. So this allows this vast development and understanding of, in this case, Egypt and its history. But there was also work with fossils in science as well. Now, all of these things are very closely monitored by Napoleon, but perhaps even more important than that is his patronage then of the arts, because Napoleon, through painting, like many of his predecessors, used images and symbols as propaganda for cultivating his image as a war hero, as an intellectual, as a supreme leader. Here in the image you see sort of the standard portrait of Napoleon. You see him decked out in his sort of standard military / gentlemanly attire there. So Napoleon is a good conservative gentleman. But there are other images of Napoleon that are also as important. For example, the image from 1806, Napoleon on his imperial throne. Bear in mind how much of a contrast this is what you saw during the French Revolution, or at least the ideals of the French Revolution. I mean, here you have someone who rivals, if not exceeds, Louis XIV in his extravagance. So here's Napoleon seated upon the throne with very rich robes that he's wearing. He has the scepter of Charlemagne on the one side and the hand of justice on the other. He's wearing laurel crown on his head, the symbol of victory. He has this massive throne. He has these carpets and rugs laid out before him. Everything about this image is meant to very, very specifically convey the notion that Napoleon is the absolute emperor and one who is in charge. Another famous picture of Napoleon that you might see rather frequently is Napoleon on horseback crossing the Alps. In this picture here, you have Napoleon as successful general, because it's true that he crossed the Alps and invaded Italy and brought Italy within the sphere of his empire. And if you see at the bottom there, there are a series of rocks with names on it. And the first one is Bonaparte, that's Napoleon himself. But there are all other generals who are successful in crossing the Alps and making headway into Italy. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general that invaded Rome, as well as it says there, Carolus Magnus, that is Charlemagne, Charles the Great. So Napoleon puts himself in that sort of history of these individuals who are great leaders, and he uses these painting and these images to convince the French people that he is actually successful. It's not just simple lies. He is successful in this way. But it is an idea that he patronizes these artists and gets these sort of paintings put out that really emphasize his greatness, his grandeur, and his leadership.